St. Joseph's College for Women Autonomous, Vishakhapatnam. Welcome to St. Joseph's open web-based learning platform, So E-Learn, for a soulful and enriching e-learning experience. Department of Commerce and Management, St. Joseph's College for Women Autonomous presents SMOOC, St. Joseph's massive open online course, Business Organization. Business Organization. Module 2, Promotion of Business. Chapter 2.5, Difference between Public and Private Company. I, Mrs. K. Pratyusha, Assistant Professor, Department of Commerce and Management, St. Joseph's College for Women Autonomous, Vishakhapatnam. Learning objectives of private versus public companies. The students will be able to know the basic difference between private and public company. Identify the characteristics of private and public companies. Understand the rules to be a private company or public company. Private versus public companies. This presentation will explore the key differences between private and public companies, covering their definitions, characteristics, ownership, management, regulations, and the advantages and disadvantages of each. Definition of a private company. A private company is a business entity that is privately owned, not publicly traded on a stock exchange. It is typically funded by the founders, family, friends, or private investors. In contrast to public companies, private companies do not offer their securities to the general public for subscription via stock exchanges. Instead, such transactions occur privately over the counter. These companies may impose restrictions on their members' ability to transfer shares. Notably, a private company can transition into a public company later in its existence, providing access to a broader range of funding opportunities. When a private entity makes this transaction, all privately held securities become publicly owned and can be listed on a stock exchange. This is a type of company that finds mention in the Companies Act 2013. The purpose of private companies is when the business is not very large, but the owners or management still want to opt for a company over a partnership or proprietorship. Now, a private company under the Companies Act enjoys certain privileges over a public company. Since a private company does not take deposits from the public, certain rules have been relaxed in their favor. Characteristics of a private company: ownership, management, regulations, financing. Coming to ownership, private companies have a small, limited number of shareholders, often the founders, family, and close investors. Coming to management, privately held companies have more centralized decision making with the owners or a small group of executives in control. Regulations. Private companies face fewer regulatory and reporting requirements than public companies. Financing. Private firms rely on internal funding, loans, or private investors rather than public stock offerings. Definition of a public company. A public company is a business entity that has issued securities such as stocks or bonds and trades them on a public stock exchange, making its shares available for purchase by the general public. As defined by the Companies Act 2013, a public company invites the general public to subscribe to its share capital to raise funds. This solicitation is facilitated by issuing a prospectus followed by the allotment of shares. Public companies allow their shareholders to transfer their shares without stringent restrictions. These companies typically list their shares on stock exchange where all trading activities are conducted with the assistance of brokers. In simple terms, public company is a company whose shares can be subscribed by members of the public. As per the Companies Act 2013, a public company is a company that is not a private company and has a minimum of 7 members. No maximum limit is mentioned. Has minimum paid up capital of 5 lakh rupees. Again, there is no maximum limit. A private company that is a subsidiary of a public company will be considered as a public company. There are certain documents required to be filled by a public company with the Register of Companies. So, let us take a look at these documents. Memorandum of Association. This is the constitution of the company, states the objectives of the company, the total capital, the name of the company, the registered address, etc. Articles of Association. This document contains rules and regulations of the internal management of the company. Prospectus. Because the company wishes to invite funds from the public, it must register and issue a prospectus or a document in lieu of prospectus. Any material misstatement in the prospectus by the directors, promoter, or experts is a criminal liability. Characteristics of a public company: ownership, management, regulations. Public companies have a large number of shareholders, including institutional investors and the general public. Public companies have more complex management structure with a board of directors overseeing the executives. Regulations. Public companies face stricter regulations, disclosure requirements, and reporting obligations to regulatory bodies and shareholders. Minimum and maximum members. A public company must have at least 7 members with no maximum limit specified. Minimum paid up capital. It is mandated to have a minimum paid up capital of 5 lakh rupees. Subsidiary status. Any private company that operates as a subsidiary of a public company is also categorized as a public company. Name suffix. Under the Companies Act 2013, every public company must append the suffix limited to its name. Few more characteristic features are: transferability of shares by its members is restricted. Such transfers are not absolutely prohibited, but there are certain restrictions put by Companies Act. This is to avoid takeovers by large companies and multinationals and ensure the sanctity of public companies. Private companies under no circumstances can accept deposits from the public. It cannot invite members of the public to subscribe to its shares earlier. Key differences in ownership and management. Ownership. Private companies have a small, limited number of shareholders, while public companies have a large, dispersed ownership structure. Management. Private companies have more centralized decision making, while public companies have a more complex management structure with a board of directors. Transparency. Public companies must be more transparent and disclose financial information, while private companies have more privacy around their operations. Few more key differences. Shareholders. Public companies are owned by a diverse group of shareholders, which can include members of the general public. Shares of public companies are traded on exchanges, allowing anyone to buy and sell them. Private limited companies, on the other hand, have a more restricted ownership base. Typically, they are owned by a smaller group of individuals, often including the company founders. The ownership is not open to the public and shares are not traded on public stock exchanges. Public and private companies also differ in their minimum requirements. Minimum of 7 shareholders is usually required to register as a public company, though this number may vary by jurisdiction. Private limited companies typically require at least 2 shareholders, making them a viable option for smaller businesses with limited ownership group. Minimum capital requirement. Public companies often have specific minimum paid up capital requirements which can be substantial. In contrast, many jurisdictions do not impose a minimum capital requirement for private limited companies, providing more flexibility for startups and small businesses. Public and private limited companies face differing levels of regulatory compliance. Public companies are subject to rigorous regulatory requirements. They must adhere to strict financial disclosure and reporting standards, including publishing annual reports that provide detailed financial information to the public. Private limited companies typically have fewer regulatory obligations. They enjoy greater privacy in their operations and may not be required to disclose financial details publicly. Share transferability. The ease of transferring shares is a critical distinction. Public company shares can be freely traded on stock exchanges, providing liquidity to investors. Shareholders have the flexibility to buy and sell the shares in the open market. Share transfer in a public limited company or private limited company is often restricted. It may require approval from existing shareholders, making it less liquid and limiting to ability easily change ownership. Access to capital. Both structures offer different avenues for raising capital. Public companies can raise substantial capital by selling shares to the public. This ability to access the broader market can be advantageous for larger scale projects. Private limited companies typically rely on a smaller group of investors and lenders for capital. While they may have access to funding, it is often on a smaller scale compared to public companies. Management and control. Management and decision making processes also differ. In a public company, management decisions are often subject to approval by the board of directors and shareholders, given the broader ownership base. Private limited companies may afford founders or a select group of shareholders greater control over decision making. Differences in regulation and reporting. Reporting. Public companies must regularly file detailed financial reports and disclosures, while private companies have fewer reporting requirements. Regulation. Public companies face stricter regulations from government agencies and stock exchanges, ensuring greater oversight and accountability. Compliance. The regulatory and reporting requirements for public companies are more complex and demanding than those for private firms. Advantages and disadvantages of private and public companies. Private companies. Greater flexibility and control for owners, less regulatory oversight and reporting, easier to make long term decisions. Coming to the disadvantages, limited access to capital, fewer growth opportunities, succession planning challenges. Coming to public companies, access to public capital markets and funding, increased visibility and prestige, ability to offer stock based compensation. Disadvantages, stricter regulations and reporting requirements, pressure to meet quarterly targets, potentially less control for founders. Let us see briefly the advantages of private companies. Management flexibility. Private companies usually have more flexibility in their management and decision making processes due to fewer regulatory oversight and reporting requirements. Less public scrutiny. The absence of constant public scrutiny can result in less pressure on management and a more long term business strategy focus. Next, focus on core business without the need to satisfy short term interests of shareholders constantly. Private companies can concentrate on their core business. Let us see the disadvantages briefly. Challenges in raising capital. Private companies may face difficulties in raising capital as their access to public markets for additional funds is more limited, potentially hindering growth and expansion plans. Limited liquidity. Investors in private companies may experience limited liquidity as there are fewer opportunities to sell their shares, making it harder for investors to exit their investments and realized returns. Coming to the advantages of public companies briefly, access to capital. Public companies can tap into financial markets to raise capital for expansion and other projects by selling stock or bonds, potentially leading to rapid growth. Liquidity. Their shares can be easily bought and sold on stock exchanges, offering greater liquidity and beneficial opportunities for investors. Transparency. They tend to be more transparent due to stringent regulations and are required to file regular financial statements with the Securities and Exchange Commission SEC. This transparency informs investors about the company's performance, reducing investment risk. Coming to the disadvantages, costly compliance. The increased transparency and regulatory compliance can be expensive and time consuming. Market pressure. Public companies face greater pressure and expectations from shareholders, often leading to short term decision making and heavy focus on stock price performance. Managing challenges. There might be a disconnect between the company's leadership and shareholders, leading to conflicts of interest and diluted decision making power, which can affect the company's strategic direction. Characteristics of a private company: ownership, management, regulations, financing. Coming to ownership, private companies have a small, limited number of shareholders, often the founders, family, and close investors. Coming to management, privately held companies have more centralized decision making with the owners or a small group of executives in control. Regulations. Private companies face fewer regulatory and reporting requirements than public companies. Financing. Private firms rely on internal funding, loans, or private investors rather than public stock offerings. Let us see what we have learned. What is private company and public company? Characteristics of both the types of companies, major differences between both the companies, advantages of both the companies. Thank you.